Hello, everybody, students in Firm and Macro, Johns Hopkins Carey. I was having a conversation with one of your fellow students, and they brought up something, and I hope that they're doing you a service. They were just kind of curious about to get a sort of a broader perspective on sort of the physical and the macroeconomic implications of our current pandemic crisis. So, and I thought, yeah, that's probably a good idea, even though um, online is not the most flexible format. That there's some some room to do this. So anyway, I do want to stress. I want to stress two things. First of all, well, I want to stress mainly that this is meant for educational purposes only. It's not meant for policy purposes. And then the other thing is that these are my views alone. They're only my views. They do not represent the views or necessarily represent the views of Johns Hopkins Carey Business School, and they definitely do not necessarily represent the views of the International Monetary Fund, which is my primary employer. Okay? So, anyway, and these are my own errors. So, this is a very standard disclaimer, but I'm making it very emphatically. Okay? So, um, every day I hear, you hear about government borrowing and huge spending packages that are resulting from the pandemic. And then the question that the student had is, well, is this creating a problem of a government debt problem or a fiscal problem going forward? And the answer is, well, actually, even before the pandemic, the US had a fiscal problem. The pandemic has made that problem worse. So in order to see what I'm talking about here, let's review some essentials of fiscal policy. Let's start off with government spending. So what do governments spend on? They spend it on goods and services. Okay, so they may, including, let's say, vaccine and testing and so on and so forth. They spend on wages and salaries. They have to compensate government employees who are providing a service. They spend on investment that includes infrastructure, roads and bridges and airports and so on and so forth. Um, and then they make transfer payments, and transfer payments include unemployment and also social entitlements, such as Social Security. Okay, and all of these are non-interest, and these are primary spending. So then there's one last category here, and that's the interest payments. And the interest payments as we'll find out, is the interest rate times the debt. Okay. On the revenue side, most of the revenue comes from taxes. However, and of course, as you probably know, there are many different kinds of taxes, but there's also some non-tax revenues. For example, when you pay a fee to the national park, that's a non-tax revenue for the federal government. Okay. Um, Now, in terms of this concept to call the deficit, in general, the deficit is an excess of spending over revenue. It's a shortfall of revenue over spending. But there are several different kinds of deficits. We talk about the total deficits, that's total spending minus revenue. And then we have the primary deficit. Now, the primary deficit is the non-interest or primary spending minus the revenue. So there's another way that we'll find very useful to express the total deficit. The total deficit is equal to the primary deficit plus the interest payments. So you can see that if you spend more or if you get less revenue, the total deficit will go up. But also, if you have higher interest payments, the total deficit will go up. Now, when we talk about debt, okay, as you probably knew, is an IOU. It's a promise to pay the creditor back some resources, some money at some time, okay, when the debt is due. But also, we want to think of the debt as the accumulation of deficits over time. So today's debt, let's say the debt at the end of 2020 will be equal to what? Well, we started off with some debt at the end of 2019. We had some interest payments on that debt, and then also the primary deficit. So we think of these two guys together, the interest payments plus the primary deficit. In some sense, that's the new or fresh borrowing that the government requires in order to finance these expenditures here. So the new debt is equal to the deficit. So the creditors, they're going to purchase this new debt. They purchase a treasury bond or a T-bill, but they expect to be paid back at some point. So now, in terms of the um, the fiscal problem, and my point that the fiscal problem existed long before the COVID crisis. Okay, these are some pictures that I got from the CBO website from the Congressional Budget Office from July 2019, long before the COVID crisis. And what do we find? First of all, everything here, by the way, is in percent of gross domestic product. So you can see that the deficit, primary deficit, is becoming. It turns out that it's, in this case, a primary deficit is a negative number. Okay, so we're going more and more and more and more and more and more and more to the deficit as we go further and further out in time. Okay, these are projections. These are projections based upon what we know about what the government will be required to spend, including on, let's say, healthcare entitlements, but also factoring in the interest payments that the government will be required to pay on on the debt that it is accumulating. So up here, okay, so you can see here, this is a projection. We're starting here after 2019. And here you can see the counterpart, the debt, and you can see that our debt is forecast to go to unprecedented highs. Okay, you can see that previously debt was somewhat high during World War II. It was high during the Great Depression. It had reached some peaks to World War I. There was the Civil War and other events before that. But where we're forecast to go now is uncharted territory in terms of the debt. Okay, so the point here, once again, is that we had a fiscal crisis in the sense that we have debt that we expected the debt to increase and increase sharply in the future. That is the U.S. fiscal problem, and most people recognize that. Okay, now if we're going to do a little bit more analysis here, I want to remind you that interest payments equal to the interest rate times the debt. So we have I as the interest rate, and we're just going to say here, this is kind of an approximation, that the interest payments is equal to today's interest rate times the debt that we inherited from yesterday. Now, it turns out that if we want to be more precise, we would say that, okay, we're paying a little bit on the debt that we're accumulating today, but this is close enough for what we're doing, okay? So that means now today's debt is equal to yesterday's debt, what we inherited, the principal plus the interest, okay, plus the primary deficit. So more spending, less revenues, minus revenues. So now, I mentioned that there are several ways to measure the debt. We can measure it in terms of dollars or trillions of dollars, but really what we want to do is we want to look at how important the debt is relative to the overall size of the economy, the debt to GDP ratio. So we have today's debt, and we divide it through by GDP today. And you know that if you divide something through the left-hand side, you also have to divide the same thing through the right-hand side. So I'm doing today's GDP, today's GDP, today's GDP. And we have a nice term here. Like I say, this is T, we're matching up the time, today and today. And then we are matching up the time here, the deficit that we run today, okay, over today's debt, or today's GDP, I'm sorry, okay. But here we have kind of a problem because we have yesterday's debt, today's GDP. This is kind of a mongrel. And the question is, how do we fix that? Well, all we need to do is realize that today's GDP is equal to yesterday's GDP times 1 plus the growth rate of GDP. So if this were 100 and this were 5%, I know that this is not, okay, then this would be 105, okay? So there you go. So the idea, now we can stick that back in, and we've got, this is nice because it's today, top and bottom. This is nice, today, top and bottom. This is nice, yesterday, top and bottom. And then this guy here, this is what we'd like to call a growth adjusted interest factor. So it's the interest rate, 1 plus the interest rate adjusted for growth. So you can see here that the higher the interest rate will push up debt, But if we have higher growth, that will bring the debt ratio down. Okay, so now, okay, this is going to help us see so kind of four big effects on the debt. First of all, okay, the first and the only good thing, the only thing that's going to help bring the debt down is in fact lower interest rates, because the Fed is lowering interest rate, it's expanding the money supply. So that's going to bring the debt down. But that the good stuff ends there because we have lower growth and because of lockdown and because of confidence and you know all of the pieces that the economic hardship, okay, lower GDP growth, that's going to push debt up. And then the primary deficit, well, we're going to have more spending, much more COVID related spending. Okay, that's what you hear about on TV. But at the same, that's going to push debt up. But also, lower tax revenue is going to be going down. Why? Because GDP is going down, and that means that the government's not going to be in such an advantageous position to collect the taxes that it normally would. Okay, so this is where I'm going to stop the video and I'm going to go to a second video where we're going to discuss this spreadsheet that I call the coronavirus sandbox. And the coronavirus sandbox is just sort of a little tool that will help you understand you know, the implications of different scenarios. And you can play with this because I'm going to make this accessible to you. Okay?